This may be one of my most important garden design videos that I have ever made, and it's more about practical design decisions than it is about aesthetic design decisions. And these are five, I'm just gonna go ahead and call them garden design mistakes that I made before I knew better. Now that I know better and I am taking into account my current garden fit, i.e. temperature, drought, heat, zoning requirements, those kind of things, I am making some garden design decisions I'm reversing some garden design decisions that I have made in the past that will inform my next garden ahead. And if you have any practical garden design mistakes or changes that you are making, that's my question of the day. Make sure to share them with the rest of us, because these are so important as we make changes to our existing garden, as we start new gardens. These are crucial. So starting with number one. Recently, Carrie, aka the Bug Whisperer, has informed me of some new, much more stringent regulations that OG&E, our local power utility company, is making about trees that are planted too close to power lines, because we have had so many ice storms recently and wind storms. Every other year there's something major. And obviously, because in these old neighborhoods we have all of these old utility lines, as I have complained about ad nauseum, you can see how an ice storm could bring a lot of them down if trees fall on top of them, or if there is a tree is too close to a transformer and it causes an issue. So now I have heard that they are literally going through the city, and any trees, even if they're not completely obstructing the lines, if they are within 10 feet of the power lines, some of them they're just taking down. I don't care how old they are. I have seen some pictures of some trees in Linwood where they just came. These were old growth trees, and so treasured here in these neighborhoods, and they're just cutting them down. And that is just a garden tragedy. That's another question I have. Have you ever experienced that? Because it's one of the worst things that can happen to you as a gardener. So in my next garden, for example, my beloved viburnum, when I was doing, now this was an addition later on, but one thing I would have done is start pruning it into a small tree at a lower height, or in a very initial garden design, because the Chinese snowball viburnum is one that I will definitely include in my next garden, I would bring it out considerably. Now, what that might mean is I lose some real estate on my property based on the location of the viburnum and what's behind it, but at least I won't lose the viburnum or whatever tree I plant, and I can still kind of underplant things behind it, but I would bring it a lot more forward than I would closer to the power lines, which often we plant because we're trying to hide them. That's been a common practice. So the same thing holds true with planting any kinds of trees too close to our house. Now, when I first planted my trees, like the Japanese maple and the blue Atlas cedar, those are small trees, so it wasn't as problematic with them. But definitely I would not plant any large trees close to my house, very much for the same reason, because even though the shade might bring down my utility costs, it nevertheless can cause all sorts of problems down the line if, because of a horrific ice storm, it falls onto my roof, it falls onto, God forbid, my utility boxes and knocks out my power completely, which would be on me for the expense. So those kind of considerations, all trees I would move further out into the landscape and probably more street side. So I would think much more carefully about my placement of trees in the future than I have in the past. So that is my garden design mistake that I would rectify in the future. I would take into account our new climate and the increased frequency of horrific weather events and how they relate to our power lines, our power grid, and our utilities. Now let's move on to number 2. Now my number 2 garden mistake is how I am going to, I guess, change my definition of living mulch, which I have been really an evangelist about forever, about planting things very, very densely so that the ground can't transpire moisture out of it because things are planted so densely, i.e. living mulch. Well, in the past, I have used a lot of ground covers as living mulch in the front yard and in the backyard. And this is a perfect example. When it looks good, I absolutely love this dwarf mondo grass. But you can see what a hit it has taken this year in these horrific temperatures and this high heat and in the brutal sun. So in the future, I probably would not plant it at all unless it was in complete shade. And areas like this, where I planted it in and amongst the stepping stones to kind of soften them, I probably just wouldn't worry about planting it at all. I would probably just have larger pieces of flagstone and more gravel. That would save me water because I don't have to water it in the future, and it would also save me a lot of labor and heartache. I wouldn't have to replace it if it died. I wouldn't have to look at it if it looks ugly like it does right now, and more importantly, I just wouldn't have to tend it and fertilize it and have the initial expense up front. And really, if I just had gravel here, aesthetically, Stuart, would it really even make that much difference? It would look virtually the same. Yeah. So I could save the expense, the heartache, the water, and it would be a much more practical solution. I wouldn't even put down a more heat tolerant ground cover. I just would dispense with the ground cover completely. Now, in the past also, I have talked about using shrubs as ground cover. And I definitely will continue to do that. And I will continue to use more shrubs, especially shrubs that are blooming, that will have 4-season interest, and that will kind of cascade, because that will give me more coverage, more living mulch in my garden beds, and I will probably plant fewer perennials in between those shrubs for color and for seasonal interest. I will rely even more heavily on blooming shrubs and evergreens as a source, as a solution, as a wonderful garden design principle for incorporating living mulch into your landscape. And speaking of evergreens, that's my number 3. My number 3 garden design mistake, it's not necessarily a mistake. Let's just say that I'm rethinking it. I am rethinking all of my heavy use of evergreens, not evergreens in general, but certain evergreens in particular, because they just haven't held up well over an expanse of, say, the past 10 years. And one of those would be things like emerald green arborvitaes, some of my yews, even Southern Living's Utopia plum yew, which I just love, my Japanese spreading yews. I absolutely love those. But certain things now that say they can grow in sun to part sun, I am now going to assume you pretty much are a part sun to shade evergreen, and you absolutely want afternoon shade in the summers. So many of us here in Oklahoma, and I bet across the South, have lost a lot of arborvitaes, of more tender evergreens, because they were fine before, but now they just can't handle these much higher temperatures or a different exposure because the exposure changed after some damage to the overhanging canopy. That's what I discovered in my front yard with my yews. So they were perfectly fine and performing beautifully before, even in these high temps. But after a weather event where lots of the branches came down, they now are in full sun to part sun instead of part sun to shade. Consequently, I'm going to think about maybe some tougher evergreens that can handle a transition caused by a weather event or a change in conditions caused by a weather event. So you may say, so what would I have planted here instead of these emerald green arborvitaes? I probably would have looked at hollies, which have performed really, really well in the heat once they get established. I would have looked at blue point junipers and different kinds of junipers, and I would have just really been observant and look at other evergreens in my community right now that are growing in full sun in this size, shape, and form. Research what they are and use that as an alternative, because what I'm looking for, more important to me, is the size and the shape and the plant's characteristics, i.e. it's evergreen and gives me garden architecture. So I am happy to substitute one form for another if it meets all of those requirements. So that's my number 3 big garden design modification that I'm making, and it's how I am defining what evergreens I use in my landscape, both tall and columnar, statement making, but also those that grow lower, more like a ground cover. Okay, let's move on to number 4. This is my number 4, and this has more to do, again, with a practical design consideration than really an aesthetic design consideration. And boy, pay attention if you are starting a new landscape or developing a new flower bed or in any way making some really major changes to some existing garden bones in your garden beds. And this is a perfect example. I'm kind of standing in here in a not so presentable area, but to make my point. When I put in my irrigation system many, many years ago, and this may be true for you as well, it was a combination of a lot of different things. A lot of mist heads that just came up and over the plant itself and watered it. Mist heads for the turf, maybe a combination of some drip irrigation. But boy, here is what I've learned, and I've talked about this before as one of the most salient considerations in getting a plant established, and that is having a dedicated bubbler head that comes off of an in-ground irrigation drip line, and I'll show you what I mean. So this, even though it's not its typical color because of the heat, this is actually, Stuart, this is a lemon cypress. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, am I telling the truth? This is
are.
a lemon cypress. This started out about this tall as a cutting that my friend Monica took for me. I had it in a pot for a while, and they practically always seem to die in the pot once the heat hits. But I thought this is going to be an experiment because it's getting too large for the pot, and I would like a vertical conical evergreen element right here in this corner. So what did I do? I planted it here, very good planting practices, but then look what I did. And I did this, I believe, in June. At the very base, I put a dedicated drip head right at the base of this plant that connects to the drip irrigation line. And what that did was it put water right at the base. This plant hasn't even suffered. It has been flying by successfully on every other, Stuart almost tripped, on every other day watering, just by having a drip irrigation system there that doesn't even have that great of output, but it's consistency. So I have made sure that it is titrated to the proper degree to get just the right amount of water on this plant. So what are the implications of that for the future? Well, one thing thing I would do if I have an existing line is maybe I would add another line off of this existing drip line and add a dedicated dedicated bubbler head. Boy, it's hot out here, Stuart. A dedicated bubbler head to this globosa spruce, maybe to some of my beloved boxwoods, maybe to that woodgilla. And then I wouldn't have to have a lot of mist heads that typically are very inefficient and don't necessarily do the job. So as I am planning a new landscape or revising my existing landscape, now every shrub in my new beds, whether in the future or my existing beds if I'm revising. So here's an intermission. Stuart's phone, because it was so hot out here, literally overheated and just stopped. So it was too close to the Linda Vater Live, so we went in and did that, and now we are finishing up this segment. So in the future, when I start a new garden, I will make sure that all of my foundation shrubs, my garden furniture, each one of those has a dedicated, or to the extent possible, has a dedicated bubbler head to not only get them established successfully, but also to hopefully ensure their long-term survival and really good water conservation. Well, if you have read my book, The Elegant and Edible Garden, you know that very much one of my muses and my inspiration was Rosemary Very's potager at Barnsley House in the Cotswolds in England. And I love that English gardening look. A lot of that, however, relies on, I think, plants, obviously, that don't necessarily do very well in my climate, but also a certain kind of garden style that might be a little bit looser and a little bit more cottagey. Well, in the future, I think I'm going, and that's fine, especially if you're into native plants. But for me, in the future, when I design my future garden, I think instead of being maybe a little bit more influenced by English style gardening, or cottage styles, I'm definitely going to look for inspiration to Australian gardens, to Mediterranean gardens, maybe even to Afghan gardens, places that garden on the extremes, extreme drought, extreme cold, extreme heat, and really look at not only the plants and the horticulture of those areas, but also some of their design fundamentals that may complement those plant choices much better. So that's another kind of revision, modification, maybe mistake I made in the past, is that I am going to look much more closely at different garden styles that more closely mimic my geography and my climate as the climate changes. Let me give you an example also of something that I would definitely change in the future in my garden design. So I love my potager. It's a fairly famous garden. It's right now in the 100th anniversary issue of Better Homes and Gardens magazine. It's been in many, many magazines and countless videos, and I do love it. I love my clipped boxwood hedge. But would I do it again? No, I probably wouldn't do it again, because I would take into account new information I now have and new happenings that now have kind of taken over the horticultural world. Things like boxwood blight, by boxwood moth. If one dies, I don't want to put all of my eggs in one basket. So I think that I would change it. So how could I change it and still get the same look? Well, I would probably plant again the boxwood balls which punctuated the ends of this stylized heart. I would do that again. These got so overgrown I had to remove them and transplant them. But would I plant this large expanse of hedge? Probably not. I would punctuate the ends with boxwood balls. Maybe I'd have the circular form in the center of boxwood, but the rest of the expanse that I am using to define and circumscribe and really contour these different zones in the potager, in the future, I wouldn't use boxwood again. I would use something like metal or stone edging or brick. So overall, in some cases where I have used a living structure like a boxwood hedge, I would in the future use an albeit kind of organic material structure, but something that was not organic. It would be like stone or metal. Now you say, but what about the pollinators? So then the other things that I would do as I am maybe planting less ground covers, as I am planting maybe less perennials, and now I'm definitely planting less annuals, I need to take that into account for the pollinators and think about planting more natives as shrubs, more native shrubs, more blooming shrubs, and in my overall future garden design really take into account pollinators, birds, living organisms as co-gardeners, gardening side by side with me as I think about my future in the garden. So there are 5 really important gardening considerations that I think maybe we all would do well to take into account for not only our gardens in the future, but the gardens that we are tending now. Well, here you go. If you've held on this long, here's my outfit of the day from top to bottom. I have my wonderful San Diego hat that I bought in Santa Fe. I'll be wearing it on and off today, depending on the sun. My top is All Saints via Poshmark. It's one of my favorite, what I think of as a little bit upper end brand, but I always buy it secondhand. My skirt is, I don't know what brand. It came from Goodwill. My belt is a chain link belt that I have had since the early 80s. I have had this absolutely forever, and it is a staple in my wardrobe. My bracelets are primarily African glass bead bracelets that I got in Santa Fe, and this tiny little bracelet fits my tiny little wrist perfectly. It belonged to my mother-in-law. And let's see, my skirt, did I say Goodwill, Stuart? And then my shoes, I believe these are just some little slides that I got from Target a number of years ago. So there you go. There is my outfit. Oh, my earrings. Uh-oh. Stuart, I was going to ask you if I forgot anything. I know. And my earrings came from Target.